Well, also just the light. Victoria.
Oh, Joel, do we need to put have you put the link up?
Daylight saving.
No.
Sorry.
It doesn't look like it's.
It was a good quality sleep today.
Yeah, so the camera's not working. So just, hit your screen. And then entire
I
screen.
knew it was really nice.
Share. And then,
Because they're like, we've got a relationship with Rick because they're like, yeah, and they do like all our events and bring there.
You just click on that
Way too early.
this one.
But the boss has like a farm all the way in, like an hour or something like that. And he goes inside. Never mind. I was just like, that's awful. And I'm like, I don't know. But that's how he explained it to me.
Do you want to move that up?
Yeah.
Oh, I can do it later.
Yeah?
Yeah, definitely do it.
So it says.
Yes. Oh, that used to be much more. Is there a label?
I was thinking last night, which one was for. Exactly.
Yeah, no, it would be. And then else too, so taller than
Okay.
the else.
That's right.
I'm 5 foot.
Okay.
So you're like 5'1"
Yeah,
or
yeah,
something.
Good to go.
It's good to go. Okay, good morning, everybody. So, my goal today is going to be to get through second part of phenomenology spirit. So we're looking at the consciousness. I'm not sure how quickly it will go. So my goal is to get through sense certainty and perception in the first part, and then leave the second part for force and understanding, and hopefully that will leave some time for questions. And let's get started. So the basic argument of the consciousness section is that any attempt to understand the object independently of the subject is going to fail. So the main argument of the section is that the realist cannot provide a consistent or complete account of objectivity, as any account you attempt to provide of objectivity implies some element of subjectivity. I've got a quote from Stuart there that sort of has the same the same basic argument. Hegel's going to unpack this in three different stages. The thing I wanted to say at the start, though, I don't know if people would agree with this. I'd like to get your opinions when we come to talk about force and understanding. In preparing this week, my thought has basically been, though, that if I was going to think of the spontaneous metaphysical way in which our dominant culture approaches reality, I think we're basically here. That's where I'd put us. I think that so for me, the argument of this chapter that a realist conception of the world that involves the idea that we can understand some sort of objective reality separate from our subjective involvement in it, that is actually untenable. I do think that that's an argument that goes against the way that our dominant culture basically perceives the world. I'd like to get people's takes on that. I do think that when people talk about knowledge in our culture, they generally mean that when we're finding something like the laws of nature, when we're finding something like the knowledge, what we're actually working at is what the world is, irrespective of who's looking at it, irrespective of our subject involvement. Once you find objective knowledge, you found something that's true for all places and for all time, and it's going to be true whether there's human beings there or not. Now, that's basically the idea that Hegel is going to go against there. His argument is going to be, no, if you have knowledge, then that knowledge is always going to involve some sort of subjective involvement. And it's not only that, because his point would also be what he has to show. Because remember, he's doing this dialectical analysis. So he can't come at any dogmatic position. He can't start by claiming, look, I'm just going to posit that there is a subject who's doing the perception, and explain then what these different forms of objective knowledge would do if we assume there's a subject. He's not going to do that. Instead, what he's going to do is say, imagine you have a form of consciousness that does believe in a subject-independent reality. Let's see that form of consciousness think about that reality, and watch them think about that reality, and just see what happens as they think it. And his argument has to be, is just by watching these different forms of reality try to grasp an object-independent reality, they're not going to be able to do it. They're going to fail. And what they're always going to find is that actually there is some subjective element involved in this knowledge that I can't get rid of. So not only do I think the basic argument of this section is quite contentious in our own cultural context, the way in which Hegel's going to prove it just involves arguing that any attempt to think of this mind-independent reality will ultimately founder and will always find itself actually involving some idea of mind. Okay. But look, if you understand that argument, that this whole section basically says that a realist attempt to give an account of objects always involves some, it turns out to be contradictory and always points back to some other subject. You basically get the argument of the whole section. The challenge is whether Hegel can convince us that these conscious structures themselves don't work just on their own criteria, just based on their own assumptions. That's going to be the really interesting thing. Let's talk about sense certainty. So Hegel tries to start with the most, what he sort of is like, this would be the most intuitive, basic way of conceptualizing objective knowledge. It's just this. I'm not going to think, so take the subject out of it. Take concepts out of it. There's no concepts. There's no culture. There's no what my parents taught me. All there is the object. So all there is not even an object. It's just what is there. I'm just perceiving what's there. It's sense certainty. So this idea of sense certainty is it's almost like take everything that you would think that a subject puts on something when they say it's an object. So, I can pick up something and go, oh, this is a whiteboard pen. But when I'm doing that, I'm obviously drawing on language. I'm drawing on categories that are taught to me. So that is obviously involves a subject. So if I just wanted to see the pen just as an object, just as it is in itself, I'd have to take out all those elements and just let the pen be. Just let it exist without trying to do anything to it. You get the idea of sense certainty. This should be the most simple, obvious form of knowledge where I'm not doing any knowing. I'm not doing anything. I'm just letting things exist as whatever they are. I'm not saying what they are. They're just there in this field of sensing. You get the idea of sense certainty. Okay. And Hegel's argument is going to be, this looks like the most immediate form of knowledge because you're not even really claiming to know anything. And his argument is going to be, if you actually try to follow sense certainty through to the end, you actually find what looks like the most concrete and direct knowledge actually involves the most abstract subjective concepts to function. So let's see how the argument goes. So he starts by saying this definition of sense certainty. So because of its concrete content, sense certainty immediately appears as the richest kind of knowledge. Indeed, a knowledge of infinite wealth for which no bounds can be found, either when we reach out into space and time in which it is dispersed, or when we take a bit of this wealth and by division enter into it. Moreover, sense certainty appears to be the truest knowledge, for it has not yet omitted anything from the object, but has the object before it in its perfect entirety. But in the event, this very certainty proves to be the most abstract and the poorest truth. All that it says about what it knows is just that it is, and its truth contains nothing but the sheer being of the thing. It's basically the argument before there. But you can see how on the surface it should be the richest knowledge in the sense that you're not putting any of these sort of human-made categories on the object, right? So if you're seeing the object just as it is. You're just letting it be. And allowing it to be itself in a way. So you do get the sense here of almost like I don't know if you get this sense certainty. I get the sense of it's almost like this romantic idea of interacting with reality. Like the world gives us these categories and these ways of looking at the world and dividing everything up, but it's just all artificial. So I'm just going to let it be and just allow existence and the object to be. That's like something like sense certainty, right? So how does it contradict itself? So in this idea of sense certainty, by the way, not only do you get rid of the object as having any definite qualities, the same thing happens for consciousness itself. Because when I'm at this sense certainty consciousness, I can't be Chris looking at the world. I can't be Australian male looking at the world. I just have to be an empty I looking at the world. I'm just likewise completely not definable. I'm a pure I. So consciousness for its part is in this certainty only as a pure I, or I am in it only as the pure this, and the object similarly only as a pure this. I, this particular I, am certain of this particular thing, not because I, insofar as I'm conscious, in knowing it, have developed myself or thought about it in various ways. As I said, like sense certainty, haven't thought about anything. Or everything you've been taught about is gone. And also not because the thing of which I'm certain, in virtue of a host of distinct qualities, would be in its own self a rich complex of connections or relating in various ways to other things, because all those things involves concepts, and we've got rid of those concepts. Neither of these has anything to do with the truth of sense certainty. Here, neither I nor the thing has the significance of a complex process of mediation. The I does not have the significance of a manifold imagining or thinking, nor does the thing signify something that has a host of qualities. On the contrary, the thing is, and it is, merely because it is. It is. This is the essential point of sense knowledge, and this pure being, or this simple immediacy, constitutes its truth. Similarly, certainly as a connection is an immediate pure connection, consciousness is I, nothing more, a pure this. The singular consciousness knows a pure this, or the single item. That's the first step in this consciousness. All that is there, all I can say of what's there, again, if you get rid of all the subjective stuff and you just allow the field of existence to appear in front of you, empty yourself of all your, it's like a meditation thing, empty yourself of all your presuppositions. You're just this pure I floating in a pure space of just what's there. And all that's there is this. There's a this here and there's a this there, and that's it. It's pure empty being, right? Okay. Oh, now a question arises here is what actual approach is Hegel criticizing? So you could read him as criticizing like epistemic foundationalism, so the position that all knowledge is derived from sense experience, or concept empiricism, the position that our concepts of objects derive from experience, or just the realist position. I just think that I don't think in this, although I think that when he starts to develop, it can eventually be criticisms of these. I just think I just see sense certainty as this, as like this way of consciousness of trying to grasp the truth of what's there in a way that's just completely anti-subject, right? Because if you think about what's my subjective, if I'm going to say there's no subjective involvement in coming up with reality, what's there? It's like, okay, well then what's there is just what's there when I take out any sort of activity of the subject, which involves things like naming and classifying and bringing in past experiences. So I don't find this first part is that he's actually criticizing a particular approach directly, or that he's criticizing someone who argued sense certainty is the basis of all knowledge. For me, Hegel is more just saying this would seem to be the easiest way to just say if objective knowledge is possible without a subject, well, this would be the type of knowledge it is. It's just an objective knowledge, there's no subjective involvement. And that would just be this sense certainty. Okay. So we've got the sense certainty involves this abstraction. You have the I under this. And then in 93, it says it is not just we who make this distinction between essence and instance, between immediacy and mediation. On the contrary, we find it within sense certainty itself. Here you have, do you know how we're talking about there's the consciousness looking on? And that's the consciousness. The we is the philosophers here. We're looking on at this consciousness. And he's saying, we've made this distinction between this empty I and the empty this. But he's like, but it's we're not putting it there. This form of consciousness has that within itself. We find it within sense certainty itself, and it is to be taken up in the form in which it is present there, not as we have defined it. One of the terms is posited in sense certainty in the form of a simple immediate being, or as the essence, the object. The other, however, is posited as what is unessential and mediated, something which in sense certainty is not in itself, but through another, the I, a knowing which knows the object only because the object is, while the knowing may either be or not be. But the object is. It is what is true, or it is the essence. It is regardless of whether it is known or not, and it remains even if it is not known, whereas there is no knowledge of the object if the object is not there. His point there is just that in this form of consciousness, yes, there is this form of knowing, the I, the mediation, but that mediation in this form of consciousness doesn't see itself as constituting the object. It says the object is there whether or not the observing I is there. So the object is, and that's what is true here, not this mediation, according to this structure in consciousness. So, the question then arises, is this object of sense certainty, this pure this, the kind of essence that sense certainty takes it to be? And Hegel argues, well, obviously his argument is no, it's not. So we say the object is a this, and a this involves a here and a now. But if I write the this down, it suddenly becomes false. So now is night, is the example he uses. So, and his point is when you write something down, it shouldn't be false. So if I go to write, so if I have this idea that I have a knowledge of objective reality, it doesn't involve the subject. What have I got? I've got a this. So I say what I have is a this, and the this is just the here and now. So, and it could be, I think you also use the example of like a house and a tree, and I'm not labeling them, of course, but it's just what's there. But that idea of a this is actually just whatever's in front of me at all, at any point in time. So now it's this, but I turn around and now that this is this. They're both this, right? And what that means is that this is sort of everything that's ever going to be in that place. But if it's everything that's ever going to be in that place, then that doesn't seem to be about the objective world at all. It's just to be about how being is how being is happening for me. But then if that's the case, it's completely reliant on me as a subject. So the very fact that I've got this abstract idea of the this, and that this just refers to whatever is happening at the moment in being for me, and it's always going to be shifting, means that what I thought I had as sense certainty is this absolute pure thing that is not being determined at all, just this is in front of me, turns out to be completely determined by me, because it's just whatever's in front of me, right? So you can't just say, okay, I'm just going to get this pure thing, this, and now I have this objective knowledge. I'm not going to classify anything at all. It's just there. Because if you're saying, well, what's there is a this, that is just always going to be changing. And and when you try to capture it, well, this is just this. That's what knowledge. And I'm not saying anything more. Then if what you have is that empty thing is actually just this container for being. It's not an actual object in the world at all. You can't get to it separate from the way you're actually involved in the world. So that this, which you thought was this specific objective thing, turns out to be nothing but this absolute universal. It's everything and anything, not a thing, not this thing. It's a structure of being in a way. Okay. So language, he says, shows you a contradiction here. It is universal too that we utter what the sensuous content is. What we say is this, the universal this, or it is, being in general. Of course, we do not envisage the universal this or being in general, but we utter the universal. In other words, we do not strictly say what in this sense certainty we mean to say, but language, as we see, is the more truthful. In it, we ourselves directly refute what we mean to say. And since the universal is the true of sense certainty, and language expresses this true alone, it is just not possible for us ever to say or express in words a sensuous being that we mean. Now, so the language, the idea here is that it's sort of exactly what I just said. If you, the moment you say, okay, you've got sense certainty, so what do you have? It's like, I've got a this. It's like, okay, but the this that we use in English, that the meaning of this, that's just anything and everything. That's just anything and everything. So the language actually reveals that what you've got is an abstract form that's completely tied up in the subject rather than something concrete and objective. Now, at this point, if you were going to argue against Hegel, you'd say something like, and I think Feuerbach has an argument like this. You'd say like, okay, let's say I believe in sense certainty. I say, Hegel, I'm not using language. Forget about language. I'm into sense certainty. I just exist, right? So forcing me to put it into language, yeah, this contradiction is going to arise. But what if I don't use language? What if I just allow it to happen without language? Now, I think the Hegelian response would be just asking this. Okay, but what do you know? Like, if you're going to claim that sense certainty gives you some knowledge of the world, some object in the world, what do you know? And I think to say, what do you know, you have to say, I know some this. I know some abstract this. And the language then, it's not that you have to use language, it's that the language is just revealing to us the structure of this consciousness insofar as what it's conceptualizing, when it thinks it's conceptualizing the object. And the moment that the sense certainty says, the consciousness says, yeah, no, it's just, it's nothing, it's this. I can't classify it because it's being. It's like, okay, but if that's your sense certainty, that being, that's got to be relative to wherever you are, right? Because that's, you're the one who's determining what the this and the now and the here is going to be. So I don't think that knocks down Hegel's point. He then applies the same thing to the here and the now. So here he's the example of the object in the tree. So one object, a tree, can be replaced with another. The here does not change. The here is something universal. Pure being remains, therefore, as the essence of this certainty, since sense certainty has demonstrated in its own self that the truth of its object is the universal. But this pure being is not an immediacy, but something to which negation and mediation are essential. In other words, this pure being is not something that exists independently of the subject. It's something where that immediate pure I that's perceiving is completely caught up in. And which means that what is here and now at this moment could change later. What's going to change that and make that this and here and now, what gives it its content, and also means that this and here and now are never going to be objective, is just this some sort of subjective involvement. Consequently, it is not what we mean by being, but is being defined as an abstraction or as a pure universal. And our meaning, for which the true of sense certainty is not the universal, is all that is left over in the face of the empty or indifferent here, now, and here. So then the object of sense certainty is the universal. It's actually not the particular. And the object that this form of consciousness thought it was grasping, which is just this object without any subjective mediation, turns out to be the exact opposite. It is actually the pure object of mediation. It is actually the form of being that happens even before we can have any objects themselves come about. So what looked like the most concrete, the most this here and now, with no subjective involvement involved at all, turns out to be to actually say what you actually know is nothing other than this mediated form of being, which is the this and here and now for a particular subject is looking at things. What looks like the most concrete turns out to involve the most abstract. So when we compare the relation in which knowing and the object first came on the scene with the relation in which they now stand in this result, we find that it is reversed. The object, which was supposed to be the essential element in sense certainty, is now the unessential element. So I thought that this table was the most essential, but in fact, what was essential was just the this, and the this I find out could just be anything. For the universal which the object has come to be is no longer what the object was supposed essentially to be for sense certainty. On the contrary, the certainty is now to be found in the opposite element, i.e. knowing, which previously was the unessential element. Its truth is in the object as my object, or in its being mine. It is because I know it. Sense certainty then, though indeed expelled from the object, is not yet thereby overcome, but only driven back into the I. And we have now to see what experience shows us about its reality in the I. So then he just makes it a further point. It's like, okay, so let's say the sense certainty consciousness admits, fine, the stability object-related being is situated in me, but I still want to hold on to this sense certainty because I want to be able to say, that it's still just the objects that this empty I is perceiving. But Hegel then says, that the same thing applies even if you make for that allowance. So, and he says, like, if you sort of admit that it becomes the here and now, and you treat sense certainty as a whole, not just as its parts. And you're no longer worried about like particular objects or a particular I, just a general here and now in a singular immediate relation. And he almost like says, I think here's at the point where he says it's almost like you're just pointing. So rather than saying, I'm just going to act as sort of admit that there's some I, but say, but it's just whatever the I is now coming in front of the I. Surely now we can say that there's no real contradiction there. But even this act of pointing also fails. And this is when you begin to get this idea that even coming up with some idea of whatever is appearing for an I at one point in time is just sense certainty, even that fails, just because the concept of what is now is not a coherent concept. So this act of pointing, if I have this sense certainty, I just want to point things out and say, I'm not saying table, I'm just this now. There's still this abstract being that's just in front of me. That also fails. I point to a now, but it's already gone. And the now I pointed to is in fact a has been and not a now at all. So I said it's a has been. So I can see it's like, yeah, well, it's not what I had isn't what is there anymore. It's a has been. But then if I say it's a has been, well, then that's not the now. And that means that what you have in this object that's not supposed to be a subject is actually not a it's not static at all. It's actually something that's continually moving. And then you have the same problem. What looked like the most concrete turns into something really universal. So the pointing out of the now is thus itself the movement which expresses what the now is in truth. A result or a plurality of nows all taken together, and the pointing out is the experience of learning that now is a universal. So then you have the argument that sense certainty contradicts itself. So it's clear that the dialectic of sense certainty is nothing else but the simple history of its movement or its experience, and sense certainty itself is nothing else but just this history. And you can see how his argument here is that I haven't brought in any judgments outside from sense certainty. I've just said sense certainty, you think you could understand the object by taking out any subjective elements and just letting it be, following that logic and just watching on as you try to articulate what you know. What I've basically seen is that the object you think it is, this concrete thing that's right in front of you, is actually an abstract mediated thing, which you can't talk about and you can't conceive without that abstract without the involvement of the subject, which is always going to involve those abstract ideas of like this and here and now. That is why the natural consciousness too is always reaching this result, learning from experience what is true in it, but equally it is always forgetting it and starting movement all over again. It is therefore astonishing when in the face of experience it is asserted as universal experience, or put forward too as a philosophical proposition, even as the outcome of skepticism, that the reality or being of external things taken as this is or sense objects has absolute truth for consciousness. So, I mean, just making the point there, it is amazing when you still see accounts of people of claiming that because we should be skeptical of all forms of human knowledge, what actually exists is just this abstract world of whatever's there in front of us. Because his point is that still involves the subject. You haven't made any progress at all. To make such an assertion is not to know what one is saying, to be unaware that one is saying the opposite of what one wants to say. I just love that line because what it points to, I don't know what people think of this, but one of the things of this dialectical analysis is that it sort of is looking forward to the idea of the unconscious, right? That we do things and we have these forms of consciousness that try to do things, and within that very activity, there's another thing we're doing that we don't realize we're doing, but is actually the truth of what we're doing. That's sort of what the idea of the unconscious is, right? And so this idea that these forms of consciousness actually don't know what they're saying, that they think this form of consciousness thinks it's getting to the absolute objective truth, but in fact what it's doing is showing the opposite. It's showing that this form of knowledge is supposed to be the most direct. It's actually the most abstract and the most reliant on some involvement of the subject. So that's just I think that's a fascinating concept also about how this dialectical analysis is going to work. That you tell me what you're trying to do. Now I'm going to watch you do it. And as I look on, I'm going to be pointing out how you're actually doing something different from what you think you're doing. And it's also clear that for Hegel, sometimes the consciousness that's making that contradiction isn't going to see it. You need this consciousness looking on to actually make that contradiction clear and to really spell it out. But nevertheless, he'll claim the contradiction's there. The degree to which Hegel's convinced is going to be the degree to which you can follow that dialectical argument and say, yes, I do see how that does contradict itself. But again, the really incredible thing here is that this whole argument has not involved bringing in any external criteria and saying, you must be wrong because I have these dogmatic beliefs. It just says, oh, sense certainty. So what's the truth for you? What's the subjective truth? Okay, let's just think it through. So you tell me what the object is. And we'll just go through the logic. And just by following your form of consciousness, I can show how it isn't incoherent with itself. So you can see this is a way of how different, I don't know how different it is from Kant, because he comes to some of the same conclusions as Kant. But whereas Kant sort of starts with he posits these transcendental categories and says, let's assume, like these are things that we just have to assume a priori because we can't think without them. Hegel's method is, we're not assuming anything. All we're doing is taking a form of consciousness that has a certain idea, and we'll just watch it think. And we'll see where it ends up. And if it doesn't contradict itself, fantastic. But his argument is going to be that when we actually follow through the logic of these positions, just based on the criteria within those positions, they're not coherent. So you arrive at some of the similar conclusions to Kant, but without starting by positing these categories that are transcendental. You're almost showing how these categories have to be the case, because otherwise you end up with contradictions in these forms of consciousness that are trying to think without them. Okay. I think I've made that point, so we're going to move on. I think I've made that point pretty well, so I'm going to move on. Okay, next one, perception. There. So, perception. Perception now comes to view objects as partly being constituted by the subject, in the sense that objects share universal qualities, attributes. And he calls these attributes universals because they're attributes that can be shared by anything. So the two key views, this is from Stern. This is not the only way of calling those two, of like defining these two views. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. That's the stratum attribute view. And that's the bundle view. Something's happened there. The basic argument here is that we now come to accept that, okay, there's going to be some subjective element involved here, which is this way of defining characteristics of objects. But this way of defining these characteristics leads to these almost like a contradictory way of seeing these objects. So the two key ways of looking and that sort of structure this section is that you have a bundle view of what an object is and a stratum attribute view. And this bundle view, Hegel is going to call the many, and he calls this the one. So let's unpack it with an example. Here's a pen. I want to say, what is this pen? So one way would be to look at its attributes. Things like its color, it's blue and white, it's cylindrical. I'm not very good with my attributes, so let me know if we're going wrong. Cylindrical, it's 10 centimeters long. I can sort of describe those attributes. One view is, if I list all those attributes and I just make a list of them, I've completely defined what the object is. It is just a list of its attributes. And it's nothing other than that. This means that when I say the pen is blue and white, I'm actually saying something about what the pen is. It is actually blue and white. I'm saying something about the being of the pen. And it also means that the pen, in terms of what it is a plurality of these attributes. The stratum attribute view is different. It would say the pen is not the sum of its attributes. It's something other than those attributes that's possessing those attributes. So it's like what Kant would call like the X, this just empty object that we have to posit so I can say there's attributes. So when I say the pen is blue and white now, I am not making a statement about what the pen is, because what the pen is just itself. That's what the pen is. The pen is the pen. That's what the pen is in terms of identity. Now, if you want me to describe the attributes, I can do that too. The pen is the pen, but the pen is also blue and white. But now when I say the pen is blue and white, I'm predicating, I'm giving you characteristics of the pen. So I'm no longer saying what the pen is, I'm giving you attributes of the pen. So this idea of perception it's a one, or it's a unity. Okay. And again, the key problem with perception is just that if you're going to say that the object is something that's existing independently of the subject, then you can't really resolve the contradiction between these two. You're going to want to say both are right, and they're both wrong. And this whole section is perception trying to resolve the conflict between those two different ways of looking at the object. Okay. So, here's another example. Let's do that. So this is an example that Hegel uses, salt. I imagine because as he was writing this, there was some salt on the table. This is the only picture in my PowerPoint presentation. It's salt. Okay. So here's a universality, whiteness and tartness. The important thing to know about universality when we talk about attributes is that these are things shared by other objects. So other objects are white. I know what whiteness is because these walls are white and Santa Claus's beard is white. Like these other objects have nothing to do with salt, but also share this attribute. Same with tartness. There's other things that are tart besides salt. Although I didn't think salt was tart, but then I thought I didn't actually know what the taste attribute of salt was. I just would have said salty, and I'm not sure that's not tautological. So I'm going to stick with tart. So the bundle view would be the also view. Is you say, okay, when I say salt is white, I'm actually saying something about the being of the salt. And if I listed all those attributes, it's white. He also says it's cubical. It's tart. Then I've got to think of what salt is. I've given a complete ontological account of salt. Even though that bundle view, you can see, it's still going to be caught up with the universal in terms of these whiteness and tartness is going to be things shared by other objects other than salt. The substratum attribute view, when I say salt is white, I'm saying something about the attributes of an unseen X, which is salt. And this object has its identity because X equals X, so it has an identity in itself. And the object is something other than its attributes, even though if you're going to ask me, yeah, but what is salt? If you take out all those attributes, I can't really point to anything and say what it is, right? Because I'm not going to be able to sense that. It's just going to be this empty, formal, logical necessity. So this is a rough outline, a poor outline of why perception fails and why these two views fail if you try to take the subject out. So the bundle view of the objects fails because the attributes of the object must be different from the object and must be different from each other to be identifiable. So the idea here is just that if I have this object like blue and white, so I say it's blue and white, it's cylindrical, I have all these characteristics. But those characteristics have meaning whether I have a pen or not, right? Their meaning comes from the attributes, the way in which this pen is sharing attributes with everything else in the world. So it seems wrong to say I've explained to you what a pen is when I've actually described a whole heap of attributes that are shared by a whole heap of things. Have I said anything about the pen, or have I just said something about the way this pen shares attributes with other things that are not the pen? So I seem to want to say something about this pen is a distinct object. It's something other than just this list of attributes. The substratum view fails because this something, if I say the pen has these attributes, so it's this X that's something other than the attributes, it seems to fail because the moment I say, yeah, but what is that? If I take out, if I say the, so I have it's cylindrical, it's blue and white. Now, none of those on their own tell me what the pen is. I have to have all of them to tell me what the pen is. But if I want to say the pen is just this X that equals X, it's separate, the pen that equals the pen, this separate thing that's separate from those universal characteristics, then the question just is, okay, what is this thing? Where do you see that? When I see a pen, I see something cylindrical. I see something that's a certain shape, size. I see something That's blue and white. That's what it is. I don't see an X that equals an X, or do I? That's the problem. I'm not perceiving this X anywhere. So how can you say this something is something other than its properties when that's definitely something that you're not perceiving in the world? Remembering that you want to be able to say this is an independent objective reality. That I'm not putting the X there, it really is an X, right? So that's why that's going to be problematic. So, and basically the consciousness just oscillates between those two. So, start of this section, he points out that perception, unlike sense certainty, sees the object as mediated by a universal, and that this universal comes in now with this idea of properties, and properties are something that are subjectively determined, like in the sense that when we talk about, you know, the blue and the white and so on, we are talking about, we're now making, talking about patterns that we're seeing in the world that are perceived. Now, to see something as a thing that with many properties involves negation, so that this, to determine its identity, has to be related to things that it's not. And so, for example, to see salt as white, I have to have a concept of white that is not salt, and that is developing by seeing things other than salt. His point here is that in perception, you can't have an idea of describing something with properties without bringing in something other than just the object in front of you. And furthermore, for that description to be determinate, then we know that these predicates have to differentiate themselves out. White means not black, but also the whiteness doesn't have anything to do with the taste or with the size. There are these different attributes that don't really relate to each other in terms of what they mean. So the first step, he starts with the also view and says, okay, the object is this pure universal medium which holds the attributes together. So the this is therefore established as a not this, or as something superseded, and hence not as a nothing, but as a determinate nothing, the nothing of the content of the this. Now, he's not talking about the one yet. He just means that if I take all these attributes and I put them together, what I'm describing is the content, the thing that's containing all these attributes is just a nothing. What it is just a series of its attributes, which are universally determined. So consequently, the sense element is still present, but not in the way it was supposed to be in immediate certainty. So not as it was in the previous one. Not as a singular item that is meant, but as a universal, or as that which would be defined as a property. So now, rather than just seeing an object as just this thing that's existing, a this, I'm now seeing it as a this with properties, which again are universal in the sense that these properties are defined by things that are out there in reality. The white is in other objects that are white. It's not just something in this object. So supersession exhibits its true twofold meaning, which we have seen in the negative. It is at once negating and preserving. So our nothing as a nothing of this preserves its immediacy and is itself sensuous, but it is universal immediacy. In other words, it's nothing but its series of its attributes. That's what it is. But it's a universal because I only understand those attributes because of my knowledge of how those attributes are relating in other objects. Being, however, is a universal in virtue of its having mediation or the negative within it. When it expresses this in its immediacy, it is differentiated or determinate property. And just again, the point being that properties have their meaning because they're different from other properties. White is not black, or white is different from not white. And those properties are different from each other in the sense that I can have all the same properties in the same pen, but its whiteness and its blueness has nothing to do with its size and shape. They're just completely distinct. They don't relate to each other, as we understand those properties. So that's just the point I've just made earlier. It holds these properties together, but those properties don't relate to each other. And then, but if the different attributes of the thing are what is universal, and so are not related to each other, then how do they come together to form an object? And that's when he says, okay, so we actually need to posit it being a one. The argument here is that in this form of consciousness, if I want to say the pen is nothing but a series of these attributes, the size, the shape, the color, and I say that's all the pen is, but those attributes have nothing to do with each other. Size doesn't relate to shape, doesn't relate to color. So how are they all coherent? I can say that the pen is white and blue, and I can say the pen is cylindrical, but those two statements just don't have to relate to each other. The only way I can make them relate to each other so I'm actually describing the pen is to say, well, there must be something that's relating them all. Because the meaning of the color and the shape doesn't implicitly, the meaning of those as universals, they don't relate to each other. So I must posit this one that's separate from the properties. And that's this one of which he says the one is the moment of negation. The one as opposed to the also. So it's not just in different unity, it's the one. Does that make sense to everyone? Pretty, okay. Okay. So 15. So then this is what the thing is for perception. It's three things. The thing is an indifferent passive universality. So it's an also of many properties. It's negation. It's the one which excludes these opposite properties. The one which is able to say it's something other than the properties. And then the properties themselves, so the relation of the two moments. So the way in which the one and the also relate to each other so that I can say what the pen is and how it relates to other objects in the world. And I unpack them as this. This could be wrong. The way I'm understanding at the moment is an object is an also of many properties. It's a one that's subtracted from these properties as a negation of those properties that carries the properties. But it's also the relation between those two moments and allowing the object to be differentiated from other objects. So once you allow for those two, you then actually are able to come to something like, oh, this is what the pen is, and this is how it's, now I can situate it, define the pen, say what the pen is separate from other things. So the consciousness of perception now has a criteria of the truth of the thing as self-identity. But, so it looks like the perception has this idea of what the object has to be. But the object also experiences differences in its perception of the thing. So when it registers these differences, it knows that what has changed is the act of perception of the object itself. So the untruth is not in the object, but the act of perception. The idea here is that because the perception is assuming the object is separate from itself, that it has this objective reality. When it realizes there's these differences in terms of how it's understanding the object, it's like, okay, well, the differences must be in me, they're not in the object. And so in 117, okay, we're going to attempt to read a passage and I'm going to unpack it in terms of a dialectical process. And this will make your head, it made my head hurt. It's so crazy. But in section 117, it's a very famous section, it basically goes through and says, okay, let's take this consciousness, and it's assuming that things are a real object, and let's see if it can get it. Okay. I don't know how something's happened with when it's come over. I don't know. It's collapsed all the words. I don't know what's happened. Anyway, I should be able to read it. So I'm going to read my understanding of it here. We're going to go through it all in my simple language, and then we're going to read the whole thing and see if it makes sense to us. Here we go. Do this one? No, that's bad. That's worse. It's the exact opposite of what I wanted to do. Sorry. That's okay. Sorry. I'll be able to read it. Okay. I hope so. So we start with the salt is a pure one. I'm going to use the example of salt, sorry. It is just what it is. It's the salt. We start with it just being an object. Okay, hang on. I'm not going to be able to read this. I'm going to pull up my computer. Okay, so the salt is a pure one. It's just what it is. It's the salt. That's what I start with. But I also see there's some universal properties in it. It's white, it's tart. These properties relate to many things. So it isn't a one then. The salt isn't just what it is as a salt. It's actually, as that one does not determine the meaning of those properties that constitute it. For me to understand what whiteness and tartness means, salt isn't enough. I need to have some universal conception of those. So then my apprehension of the object being a one was actually incorrect. Its essence, its universality, is actually a meaning of those universal predicates. To understand what the salt is, I need to understand what whiteness is and what tartness is. And to understand what those things are, I need to go out into the world and see the universal instantiation of all these different properties and to see what they mean. But hang on, any of these universal properties have nothing to do with each other. So taste has nothing to do with touch or color. So for these different properties to be related, I have to posit a one. So for me to say that these different properties are actually just describing this object, I have to say that there must be a one that's holding those predicates together. But now it's a broken up one. It's a broken up one of many's. It's a broken up one of indifferent properties. But hang on, lots of things have these properties. So these cannot be exclusive to the one. Just listing of these universal properties doesn't give me a meaning of this one. So I then am going to say that there is a universal common medium in which properties are presented as universalities, and this is all there is. So at this stage, I get to the point, sorry, I'm on the next slide now, here. So then, so these properties as they exist, sorry, what do I do? Yeah, but then the truth is not the community of universalities, but these properties as they exist in isolation. So the world is just one whole heap of individual properties that help determine each other through their differences, and understanding those properties are going to help me understand what these objects actually are. But in fact, these properties don't form a whole because a property doesn't relate. Oh, sorry. But if we see properties that way, then the property that doesn't relate to an object is not a property. Oh, sorry. No, the problem here is that the property, if you just say property, all you have is a whole thing of different properties, then you're not actually saying anything about objects because those properties aren't relating to objects anymore. But a property that doesn't relate to an object is not a property. Something else, right? So it's not a property at all. But then if I come back to this one, the one can only be a sensuous being in general, one that lacks any properties, but then that one is the one that I put there. And so that definitely can't be the thing at all because I'm not perceiving that anywhere. It's just something I'm assuming is there. And we go back to the start. That's the 1-1, that's 117. Okay, now let's try to read it. Do you get this sense like what we have in this stage of consciousness is like struggling to go, oh, it's one thing, no, it's many things. No, it's one thing, no, it's many things. And it's like, I can't do it. It's like it just keeps going around these circles and it can't be happy with other. Okay. So in the broken up one, I find many properties which do not affect one another, but are mutually indifferent. Is everyone pretty happy with that now? It's like you have these properties, blue and white, cylindrical, they don't affect each other. They're indifferent to each other. They just mean different things. Therefore, I did not perceive the object correctly when I apprehended it as exclusive. So I thought this pen was a unique pen. That's wrong. On the contrary, just as previously it was only continuity in general, so now it is a universal common medium in which many properties are present as sensuous universalities, each existing on its own account and as determinate excluding the others. So in fact, what the object is this also. It's a series of determinate things that are excluding everything else. So it's a series of these universal properties. Okay, but this being so, what I perceive as the simple and the true is also not a universal medium, but the single property by itself, which however as such is neither a property nor a determinate being. So his point here is that, but hang on, if that's the case, what is true is not the way these things are all related to each other, but the properties as actually broken up. Whiteness, roundness. It's always like it's not your idealism here, right? So now it is neither in a one nor connected with the others. It's just what it means in isolation. Only when it belongs to one is it a property, and only in relation to others is it determinate. As this pure relating of itself to itself, it remains merely a sensuous being in general, since it no longer possesses the character of negativity. So I don't know when it's relating to itself there. So only when it belongs to one is it a property, and only in relation to others is it determinate. So that's just making the point that the property can't be a property unless it's relating to one, and it only can have meaning if it's relating to other properties. And this pure relating of itself to itself remains merely a sensuous being in general, since it no longer possesses the character of negativity. And the consciousness which takes its objects to be a sensuous being is only my meaning. It has ceased altogether to perceive as withdrawn into itself. So if I see the object as a pure thing separate from its sensuous things, then all I'm really seeing is what I'm putting in the object. I'm not seeing something that's actually there in terms of its properties. But this sensuous being and my meaning themselves pass over into perception. And throw back. Did I start on the wrong one? Oh, sorry, I did. I'm an idiot. Okay, let's start from the beginning. So let us now see what consciousness experience in its actual perceiving. So for us, this experience has already contained the development of the object and the attitude of consciousness towards given just now. So it is only a matter of developing the contradictions. Again, that's really just a clear statement of the dialectical method. I've explained the things. Now let's see how this pans out. So the object which I apprehend presents itself purely as a one, but I perceive it as a property which is universal and which thereby transcends the singularity of the object. So the first being of the objective essence as one was therefore not its true being. So it's actually got to be these properties that are universal, which aren't contained in the pen, like whiteness and size and so on. But since the object is what is true, the untruth falls in me. My apprehension was not correct. So I was wrong when I thought the object was something separate from its universal properties. So on the account of the universality of property, I must rather take the objective essence to be on the whole a community. So I now further perceive the property to be determinate opposed to another and excluding it. Thus, I did not in fact apprehend the objective essence correctly when I defined it as a community with others, or as a continuity. So I now see it as this whole community. The universality is this community of different things, but that's got to be wrong because they don't relate to each other. So you can't call them a community of all because they break up the continuity. So I've got to come back to positing the objective essence of the one that excludes. And then you come to the next stage. And in this one that excludes, I find there are many properties which are mutually indifferent. Therefore, I did not perceive the object correctly when I apprehended it as exclusive. In other words, I can't just say the pen is the pen because all the things that define it are related to this common universal medium, which present the properties as sensuous universalities. And then I perceive the universal medium as what's true, but then I realize that they don't relate to itself, so it's actually the individual properties that are true. But then a property that doesn't relate to an object is not a property, so I've got to go back to positing it as an object. But then that's just me making that an object, and then sensuous being and my meaning seem to pass over into perception. And I'm throwing back to the beginning. The whole point of the dialectic, though, is that again, he's just following through on what this consciousness is trying to grasp what the object is. And the problem is just that this consciousness is treating the object as something independent from subjectivity. That's the problem. Okay. And I'm going to quickly wrap up this section, and then there's not much more to say. I think that's the main gist of the perception section. So 118 to 121, it goes through a process of the consciousness now says, okay, I'm doing one or two things. Either it's me who's putting the object there, making it an X, and it's not really. So I'm going to assume that that's just me and just treat it as universal properties. Or it could do the opposite, and that doesn't work out. So it does the opposite and says, okay, I'm going to assume I'm the one saying these universals are actually just my sensuous, they're all universals to me. So it's just I'm doing that, but the one is really there. And that fails as well. So what you have in this section is the consciousness basically saying, I'm going to assume that I'm doing one of these two things. It's either me positing there's an X when there isn't. So I'm going to try to think without that, and I'm going to try and think the object, but knowing that it's my activity that's making the X. Can I get a clear objective view of the object that way? And it fails. So then it tries the opposite. I'm now going to assume that it's these qualities that I'm seeing that are related to my senses. That this is tart because it's tart for me. It's white because it's white for human beings. That they're actually what the subject is putting in, and assume that what's really there is a subjective X. And again, it fails. So consciousness trying to say, okay, half of it is me, but half of it's the real world, still doesn't work. And so it comes to the conclusion that its involvement is what's causing a split in the object. And so now consciousness has to come take responsibility for what it previously ascribed and now ascribes to the thing. So we see that consciousness makes itself as well as the thing into both a pure meaningless one and into an also that resolves itself into independent matters. Consciousness thus finds through this comparison that only its truthful perceiving contains the distinct moments of apprehension and withdrawal into itself, but rather the truth itself, the thing, reveals itself in this twofold way. Our experience then is this, that the thing exhibits itself for the consciousness apprehending it in a specific manner, but is at the same time reflected out of the way in which it presents itself to consciousness and back into itself. In other words, it contains its own self in opposite truth. Okay. And then the third movement now sees the thing as formed by the relationship between object and perceiver. And that's how the section finishes. So the relational definition of the object means that it's always caught up with what is not, and its identity as a for itself is how it relates negatively to its other properties. So this whole, what looks like a contradiction is actually a part of just what the object is. And that's the conclusion of the section. So the dialectic shows that it's impossible to conceive of an object without the involvement of the subject. Again, what seemed at first to be concerned with the most concrete features of the world is shown to be caught up in universal abstractions, and so the activity of the subject. You can't think the object without the subject. And there's a final thing on there that's the sophistry of perception seeks to save these moments from their contradiction, and it seeks to lay hold on the truth by distinguishing between aspects by sticking to the also and to the insofar, and finally by distinguishing the unessential aspect from an essence which is opposed to it. But that's basically his description of what this consciousness tried to do. But all of them, all these expedients, instead of warding off deception in the process of apprehension, prove themselves on the contrary to be quite empty. And the truth is supposed to be won by this logic of the perceptual process, proves to be one and the same respect opposite, and thus to have its essence in a universality which is devoid of distinctions and determinations. And so ultimately, yes, you do need the point is that these contradictions, also point of Hegel and philosophy, what looks like these contradictions in how you conceive the object is actually just part of what the object is. And once you see the subject involved in that, then it's actually not a contradiction at all. The contradiction is just part of that reality. Okay, I'm going to pause there, and after for 10 minutes, and so at 11:10 we'll come back and discuss we'll discuss force and understanding.
Yeah, Hegel is really so it's just like that's so funny. I feel like it's already funny and oh no, it's fascinating. So
Yeah.
it's like
How do you get to that point where you are Hegel? You're like, yeah, I'm gonna write this down. Like, why? We're still talking about it. I don't understand that shit. Oh, you just imagine what kind of a guy is coming through.
well, it's something so like sophisticated and systematic,
Yeah.
but also so well like that. It's like friendship and I mean, it's kind of consistent with
Yeah.
Hegel's metaphor to his car. Totally, especially or that we at least have everything. Yeah, it's a lot of stuff. How do you learn Hegel in the past?
No.
I like probably my life.
It's not fun. You actually feel like an idiot.
Yeah, I had a Hegel reading that I was telling Chris a few years ago. I was really like it was really when I started reading other philosophers I really admire on Hegel. I found a way kind of back
Yeah.
to Hegel.
Yeah, you can't read him without reading stuff.
Yeah. And I think also in terms of finding like the practical payoff.
Yeah.
Sort of,
Yeah.
Like the new was like Ransom and stuff.
Yeah.
And that was okay, I really understand potential states of this down.
Yeah.
And then that kind of like gives you the strength and the spiritual nourishment to resist.
Yeah. No, I remember the first time I came from undergrad, I was just doing this the whole time. And you have to use the silliest examples, like to try to talk about. So I can use, I don't know why the professor chose a banana couch, because I just can't remember being I think because he tried to draw into it. It's so often gone. And it can't look at the banana, so it's like, okay, go to the banana couch. That's all I remember when he said, like, okay, the example of the banana couch. Just imagining this crazy house.
Hey, Joel. If I just want to update the slides.
Yeah, it's like you really have to keep
So,
stop.
Yeah.
I'll just stop it. Yeah.
No unusual up here.
Oh no, don't stop that.
Okay.
Just close it.
Close it and flip it.
In a way. I think that's
Lots of people chatting.
Yeah, they are.
Even when you talk to hardcore aliens, they'll
Yeah.
There's so much now.
They're just messages you're gonna enjoy.
And just have done it. Can you imagine trying to yeah, you probably cover incredible stuff, but the process.
Did you want to deal with some of these questions before you start the next section?
I didn't even know what point they're asked, what they're talking about. So
I was gonna say the great thing about
I might try to
it's just such a pleasure.
get to the end of the session.
Makes me laugh. Very reasonable. We're gonna do philosophy, make me laugh.
They're jokes in this.
Yeah.
And it's always simple. I didn't do that.
Hegel ain't funny.
Actually, one of my favorites that always gets me in each other it's the attempted self-criticism.
Mhm.
When he says that a tragedy in hindsight smells offensively again.
My boys are like, why? I'm too smart. Why? I write such great books.
Yeah.
Did you say this is up?
Yeah, it's me. You had a great time talking about it.
You have to come back.
What was that?
You have to come back.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's July. Was it in? Yes. So we got here on Thursday, we're gonna like 7:30 a.m. We've been in transit for like 36 hours. We somehow stayed up all day.
Okay.
Yeah, well, we were trying to be the jet lag.
Oh,
Because I knew I didn't be
like
first.
Yeah.
I think I was a little bit of John for this one. Oh, yeah. But when they were, like,
Yeah.
it was just,
Oh.
yeah.
I think the jet lag
Oh,
helped. Yeah, Hegel was making more sense when things are over.
Yeah.
Yeah.
100%. I was just subject which was truly terrible. I don't know why I did it. I think I liked the name of the stuff. I can't even remember that name. The subject just looked something like meaning possibility.
Oh.
How can that not be? It's just not
Yeah.
at all. But I went to the other lectures, asked her how many years. And I was just like,
What happened? So if I click on that to share.
Yep.
It's the principle.
I just have
I forgot.
entire screen. And you need to open it, yeah. And then show taskbar.
That was her whole personality, of being really clumsy and kind of being installed into the dumbest consideration. And she knew it, she owned it, and she'd say, I'm gonna say,
Because the font is different on here. I know I've corrected the issue. Should we go to the next slide that you're up to?
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah,
She just was like,
That's right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it turns out she was operating on high level the entire time.
Yeah.
She just had like dialect.
And it just
Oh,
became the
like,
funniest thing.
Yeah.
And I had been saying, like, leading up, being like, you know, when we get to that, it's gonna be.
Oh, I agree. I agree.
And she was like,
Yeah,
yeah, so it's
I
like.
agree with that. Yeah, okay. But you're
And everyone's like,
descriptive.
yeah, really well.
The ambitious ones.
Yeah, yeah. And she just relaxed, and she's like, yeah, makes sense. We were like,
Hold it on.
that's fine, fine. Yeah.
Yeah. Spend
I was like,
It's like, just because shit everyone has.
yeah.
You just never know what you're gonna make yourself be. Like, that must be part of the real thing. I don't think I do have to teach.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a description.
I understand.
Oh, okay. So it's an almost.
Yeah. I never cried, actually. Like, starting at the night.
All
Look it up, yeah. And Charlie.
Okay.
Oh.
Sorry about that.
On to the last part of this section, force and understanding, and then so this section is notoriously difficult. I'm definitely not claiming to understand it. This is the claim I'm making. So what you're probably going to hear is other confused ramblings of someone still trying to grasp what is happening in this section. I remember the first time I got to force understanding, I felt like I'd gone from like self-certainty and perception. It's sort of like, yeah, like I was following this. This is interesting. This is like philosophy. It's like metaphysics. It's fine. And then I got to forced understanding, and I'm just like, what the hell is going on? What are you talking about? And there's just a massive. It's almost like you sort of feel like, yeah, I've got you. It's hard, but I'm following. And then you get to forced understanding. You just feel like you've been thrown into a deep end, and you're now the Hegelese is completely over your head, and you're just swimming in a confused morass of obscurantism. So what I'm going to attempt to do is explain what I see at this stage of my understanding as what forced understanding is about. I'm going to focus a lot on what I see as the most interesting part of the section, and that's his arguments against the problems with scientific law, because I think they're the most relevant and the most interesting. But all I will say is that I have to read more, and so I'm just apologize in advance. But here's my attempt. Okay, so consciousness now abandons. So from here on, I'm going to pretend I know what I'm talking about, and we'll just play along. Okay. So consciousness now abandons the common sense view of objects as things with properties to a view that comes from understanding. So now it's sort of said that I actually, to really grasp the world, I have to accept that I need to use my own categories of understanding, things like logic, to actually understand what's in the world. There's something that's actually beyond sense perception, which can only be grasped by the faculty of thought. And so this is the view that appearances are manifestations of a supersensible realm, and supersensible just means like a realm. Think of a realm that's beyond senses, something that we can't sense, which has a causal relationship with appearance. And the word that he gives this with is force. And we don't use the word force anymore, but in Hegel's time, that was a word that was often used to describe forces of nature, things like electricity or gravity. They were forces. And the point of appealing to a force is that it's not something that you sense. You only ever sense with your perceptions, like your senses. Sense with your senses. Instantiations of the force. The force is acting on things in the physical world. So at this stage, when I think force, just think of, well, what's it? It's like what's gravity? Well, it's like a force. It's like acting on things, but you don't really see it. What you just see is everything affected by it. So, but do you see how? But it's still something working through nature. It's a force, right? So consciousness here is abandoning the view of objects as sensuous things, and now they see reality as an interconnection of internally related forces that are both expressed in reality, but also as something beyond this reality. The important thing to remember as to why this approach doesn't work is just this, and this is what Hegel is criticizing. It's the view that when you talk about something like the law, skip to the end. When you talk about something like the laws of nature, and you act as if that conception of the law of nature is something that is existing independent from that human activity of knowing, and that it's explaining everything that's happening in appearance, that's what's problematic. So it's not that, so in terms of Hegel's criticism of science, it's not that it's wrong. It's not that the law of gravity, that Newton discovered is false. The point is that when you discover that, it's only really useful for explanation within the context of particular human endeavors. That's sort of where we head to. So what you haven't done when you articulate the world in terms of these non-observable, almost like forces that exist beyond the realm of like appearance, what you haven't done is given a complete explanation for appearance. It doesn't work as giving a complete explanation. That's his criticism. So it's not that it's wrong, it's that it's not what it claims to be. Because what it's claiming to be is, I've now got objective truth. The objective truth of the world, what's really there, is this series of natural laws, or this series of forces, which is beyond appearance. And Hegel would say, no, you haven't got the truth. What you have is a particular product of community attempting to know the world for particular purposes. And when you articulate it like that, then it has some sense of purpose. if you try to say, no, I've discovered the truth of everything, it's these laws, Hegel would say, as we're going to get to, you haven't really explained anything. Oh, man, it's such a contentious claim. Such a contentious claim. It's so interesting. Okay, so let's see how we go. So first of all is the introduction of force. So he says, force is the undivided unity of all that reveals itself in appearance while being something other than this appearance. So gravity is just a good example. So in other words, the matters posited as independent directly pass into their unity, and their unity directly unfolds its diversity. And this once again reduces itself to unity. But this movement is what is called force. So in terms of this diversity and unity, the way that I understand that is just that I drop the pen and it goes down, and then I drop this pen and it goes down. And they're both instances, they're both matters of gravity. Gravity reveals itself when that happens, but it also is not that. It's something other than that because it happens every time I drop something. So it's not just that it's revealed itself, but it's also hidden itself in a way because it's something other than just that instantiation, right? So one of these moments, the dispersal of independent matters in their immediate being is the expression of force. So that's the expression of force. But then there's this idea of force proper, and force proper would be the actual law of gravity that's causing that force to happen, driven back into itself from its expression. Sorry, I've got to be careful. There is a distinction between force. Force is separate from an idea of a law of nature. Force is, when you think of force, just think of that, whatever the natural energy is that's producing, that's the force. It's the force. It's like the thing that's making that go down. It's the force. Okay. So this idea of force already, you see, is as necessary and undetermined by thought. So if you think of force as something I'm discovering the real truth of what's there in nature, then that's both undetermined, so it's necessary, and it's undetermined by thought. So in order then that force may be in truth be, it must be completely set free from thought. It must be something that exists independently from my thought of it. And it must be posited as the substance of these differences. So first, the substance of the whole force, gravity, as it is in itself, and then its actual differences as they exist in the world. So the idea here is that if you assume force is something that is not thought, it's independent of thought, then you're going to posit that force on the one hand is something ethereal existing outside of its instantiations, like this, like a force. It's almost always there in the background. And you're going to see, and it's also something that's there whenever it manifests. It's both. It's going to be both when it actually is appearing in the world, and also this idea of it being somewhere else, always subsisting in some way. Okay. No. So this is my example of gravity. I drop a pen, and what appears to me is a pen pulled down to the earth because of its weight. Now, of course, according to gravity, that's wrong. When you see there's an expression of the force of gravity, what's actually happening is that because the earth is moving in a certain way, it's pulling the pen towards it. But when you see force in that way, you begin to see how the pen just becomes almost confused with a whole multitude of different things also undergoing that same force, being pulled towards that force. So all of a sudden I see all these matters, everything suddenly being pulled down, and that all of these things being pulled down is all this vector, this force. But I haven't actually seen force proper there. What I'm actually seeing is a chair on the ground or a pen drop. I'm not seeing gravity. Gravity is something else. It's this abstract force that's making that happen, right? So in a sense, gravity is always appearing, but in another sense, it's not. It's the abstract force that's making that appearing happen. Because remember, in this understanding, I'm saying that I want to get to the object of what's there, this objective truth that's not subjective, right? So when I say I find these different instantiations of gravity, I can't just say, oh, I'm the one who's just pulling all these patterns together and I'm positing this idea of reality. The idea has to be, no, there's something separate existing that repeatedly makes all these separate things go down. Okay, well, there must be something like force that's existing outside of reality that's doing that. You begin to see the split that force creates, right? There's a sensible world, and there's this ethereal, mysterious world that we don't quite see, where the truth of everything is. And if I can get to that mysterious other world, I'll understand all the appearances in this world. Okay. Dialectic of force understanding. So force on the one hand is something that relies on the understanding. So here the language is, it's like force solicits so that it needs to be solicited or understood by the subject. So it is seen as both dependent on cognition and independent on cognition. So the simple, again, the example here would be when Newton discovers the law of gravity and he's able to explain the way in which things on the terrestrial phenomenon is the same as the celestial phenomenon, and brings the two together with the law of gravity. On one hand, that to be expressed, that thought had to be seen by Newton and had to be summarized by Newton. So already the force solicited Newton and said, bring all these together and identify the pattern and express that. But on the other hand, once Newton does that, it's like, oh, but what he's found is really objectively true. What he's found is actually something outside, which is this force that's outside of appearance. So it is both seen as dependent on cognition, independent of cognition. So in the first place, the second force appears as the one that solicits, and moreover, in accordance with its content, as the universal medium in relation to the force characterized as the one solicited. There was another reading here where the two forces. This part confused me. The two forces are actually, one is the person is actually the subject themselves, like the subject of themselves interpreting. This section though comes after another part where it's like he's talking about, which I've skipped over, but he talks about form and content, and then another way, as one way of unpacking the difference in force, and then there's another example. So I think he's referring to that too. But the second force is essentially an alternation of these two moments and is itself force. It is likewise the universal medium only through its being solicited as such. And similarly too, it is a negative unity. It solicits the retraction of force only through its being solicited to do so. So in the two ideas he has of understanding force there, in either way, you have this idea that for force to be seen, there's a sense in which it's soliciting the subject or soliciting the knower in some way to identify this as a pattern, to identify this as a force. So this is just the idea of the force and appearance, that force is always going to be something other than appearance. So the notion of force rather preserves itself as the essence and its very actuality. So the point was the point I made earlier. Even though it's admitted that the force is in a way soliciting the subject, it comes to be seen as something separate from this subjective involvement. It's something that exists on its own. So the notion of force rather preserves itself as the essence and its very actuality. So force as actual exists simply and solely in its expression, which at the same time is nothing else than a supersession of itself. Just because, as I said, you have an instantiation of gravity, but the actual force expressing is always going to be something over and above just that single instance of a expression of force. So this actual force, when thought of as free from its expression as being for itself, is force driven back into itself. In the fact, this determinateness, as we have found, is itself only a moment of force's expression. Thus, the truth of force remains only the thought of it. The moments of its actuality, their substances and their movement collapse unresistingly into an undifferentiated unity, a unity which is not force driven back into itself, but is its notion qua notion. Okay, so the notion qua notion of force, so force insofar as it is, just insofar as it is actually a thought, would be, I know I'm getting mixed up between this and another section. The key idea is that the force is this loss of reality. It's always driven back into itself. And the point just being, the point being that force is a realization of the loss of reality. It's just that the force is always something other than whatever we're observing at the time. But also that the notion of force, so the very idea of force, insofar as it's an idea, must be something that is, almost want to say, no, I think I've lost that. But it's the point that force is something that by definition can't be just what's appearing in the world. That insofar as it's a force, it's that loss. It's something other than reality. So then the consciousness would say, well, then force is like this true background, right? So the true essence of things has now the character of not being immediately for consciousness. But on the contrary, consciousness has a mediated relation to the inner being, and as the understanding looks through this mediating play of forces into the true background of things. And so you have to have the understanding to unite that inner world, which is like that being of the force, that law of gravity, so that idea of gravity, that force of gravity, which we know exists in a way that's not perceived directly. And we know that then what we see in terms of appearing is always going to be something other than that force. So the force is what is not going to appear. So which means that what we see in appearance is always a surface show. It's not the real thing. And that means you have the two-tiered view of reality. Within this inner truth that is the absolute universal, which has been purged of the antithesis between the universal and the individual, has become the object of the understanding. There now opens up a sensuous world. So you now have a world of appearance and a supersensible world, which is the true world, above the vanishing present world. That opens up this permanent beyond. I'm not sure how convincing you find this. I find it pretty convincing. When you begin to think of what he taught this idea of there being natural laws that just exist in nature, but you don't perceive them anywhere. They're perceived in terms of their effects. But when we say there are these laws of nature, how are those laws of nature existing? Especially if you see these laws of nature as something that exists separate from the world. When we find the law of gravity, we're describing this thing that it always exists behind of appearance. And when I get to that thing behind appearance, I've actually now explained what appearance is. So whatever this beyond appearance, this is actually explaining what is in appearance, right? And so this idea of the force leads to this two-tiered view. I have appearance, the world of appearances, the things I can see, and I have a world that's beyond that, this world of the truth of it, which is a non-sensible, a super-sensible world made of these forces which allow me to account for what's really there. But they have this objective, separate existence. So I have a two-tier view of reality. But this super-sensible world, Hegel says, must be completely empty. It would like to be this complete void. And the example he uses, like this inner world, the super-sensible beyond, even though it comes from being and has this appearance, it would just be this. It would just be like he says. The example would be taking a blind person into the world, or putting someone in a world where there's just absolute light. There's just nothing there. Like there's no. If you think of gravity separate from all its instantiations, what is it? Is it a mathematical formula? Like, what is it?
Force.
But let's be honest. So you go, okay, I've got this world of appearance, this deceptive world where I have all these instantiations of gravity, but I want to get to the force. I want to see what's really there. What's really there are these forces. Okay, so forget about the world. I just want to get to the force. What would that be? Because all we actually have is what we see through our senses, right? So then he says that the supersensible is therefore the appearance by appearance. And the way I read that is, well, the supersensible really is just what makes appearance look like it's just appearance. When we look at the world and we believe in force, it's like, well, what is appearing is actually just an appearance. There's something beyond that. And that's what he says the supersensible is. The supersensible is just the fact that now when I look at the world, I'm seeing a world of appearance rather than what's really there. What's really there is this force, which I can't see. Okay. This then introduces the realm of law. This is the fun part. Okay, this is the interesting part. So he then says this realm of law then comes about to fill out the supersensible. So what we say is like, okay, forget about forces. What there are laws of nature. And what the laws of nature do is they take this void, this horrible, scary void of the supersensible, and we go, we're going to populate it with these laws that make it seem stable and unchanging. And when you think of, I'd like to see what, like, if you called an analysis of this, but the idea of a law of nature, I think I'd say it would come from the idea that, you know, when Galileo is developing science, he goes, mathematics is the language in which the universe is written. So the idea is that God is a rational God. So it makes sense that he'd have these rational principles explaining everything. So when we look into nature, we'll find the language of mathematics, and we're actually just finding what's actually there because God wrote everything, right? So then so this idea of there being laws, and you think about that, that's a metaphor, right? I don't know. Sorry, my mind is blown with this thought. But when you say laws of nature, you're using a metaphor, because if you have a law, you have to have a lawgiver. You're talking about someone intentionally creating an order. So when we say laws of nature, we're importing a theistic language to describing what's there. So now we've got this, it says there. So now, okay, this is still, I think, how most of us view the world. I've always looked at the world, there's a scientific understanding, there's laws of nature, fine. What's problematic about that concept? That's fine. So what Hegel's going to show is that it's actually quite problematic. And there's reasons why you can't just talk about these laws of nature as being separate. So here are the three main problems with the idea of there being a law of nature. The first law of nature, I find each of these really fascinating. Okay, is that it just tends to be reducible to, it tends towards more and more reducible laws. But the more your laws become abstract, the less they explain about concrete reality, right? So the idea is this. I have a law, and this is actually a really common idea. You can still read scientists today going, oh, we're after the theory of everything. Once we find the theory of everything, what we'll have found is the one law that founds all the other laws. So there's a sense in which the moment you have this idea of a law of nature, it's going to want to tend towards a single law. But when you actually have a single law of nature and you try to say everything is just this single law of nature, Hegel says, what have you explained? Absolutely nothing. So there's this inverse relationship between, on one hand, you have law wanting to become more and more abstract, and it wants to become more and more unified, so that I can just say there's just one law, and it is this. This law explains everything. But the more abstract the law is, the less it explains about concrete reality. The more it doesn't actually explain anything. So when it comes to the law, the more abstract law is, the more we think it has explanatory force. And Hegel will say, no, the more abstract it is, the less it has any explanatory force. Man, that's one idea. The second one, saying that something's a law of nature does not explain why it's a law of nature. You're just asserting it. So if I say the pen falls down, there's an example I'll do later. But the pen falls down, why? Oh, because there's a law, there's a force of gravity. Why there's a force of gravity? Because there's a law of gravity. Why is there a law of gravity though? Just is. Well, then all I've really said is that the pen falls down because it does. Like, what have I actually explained? Why this law and not another law? Why does it have to be that case? Now, I think a scientist would be like, yeah, but what we do then is we say we do try to answer that question. We will try to find more fundamental laws, in which case, see problem one. Right? You can get more and more abstract laws, fine, you explain that one. But you're eventually going to get to a point where just saying a law is this law because of this law because of this law, you eventually get to a stopping point where it's like, oh, this is just a law just because it is. Like I don't see, just because of what the nature of this idea of a law is. Then the third problem, which is one I still don't quite understand, is that the explanation of natural phenomena using natural law is tautological. And so while laws help us generalize about diverse phenomena of nature, appealing to natural law is not just another description. It's actually not a genuine explanation at all. So Hegel's argument here seems to be saying the pen falls because of gravity is just another way of describing the pen falling. It's not explaining why the pen is falling. Okay, sorry. Just to get, this is important because Hegel's point, I think, it's not that science is wrong. It's not that these laws are not accurate. It's that we are seeing them as explaining this realm that exists separately from human beings, rather than a result of human beings working through a series of knowledge in ways that are useful to them. So Hegelian answer as to what the point of the theory of gravity is always going to be tied up in what human beings are doing to it. It's not going to be, oh yeah, we found this law of gravity and now we've explained this objective truth that exists independently of human beings, and that explains everything. That's what's there. So it's not that it's false, it's that to understand why the law of gravity does have a purpose, you can't do that if you're going to take it out of the human context in which it's being developed. So now, I'm going to read through now the passages where he brings in these arguments. So the idea of law ultimately appeals to an unchanging universal real, and as such it cannot fill out the world of appearance. But this reality then must ultimately resolve itself into one law. So the idea of law itself wants to push itself into one law. There must be unity. However, insofar as it is not law in general but a law, it does not contain determinateness. Consequently, there are indefinitely many laws. But this plurality is itself a defect, for it contradicts the principle of the understanding for which, as consciousness of the simple inner world, the true is implicitly universal unity. It must therefore let the many collapse into one law. But then once you have one law, it's pretty useless. So there's actually an example. This is, I think, the principle from Stewart, which makes it really clear. So the more general or encompassing a law becomes, the less able it is to describe phenomena accurately in their individual details. For Hegel, a fully universal law is always ultimately hollow or devoid of content, and thus is inadequate for explaining the particular phenomena. The law is universal, and as such, it is indeterminate and cannot be said to render anything determinate. And this is an example of a universal law. This applies to everything, but then it says nothing. Universal attraction merely asserts that everything has a constant difference in relation to other things. Universal law. Nothing in reality doesn't have a relation to other things, right? Sorry, what is it? Doesn't have a constant difference in relation to other things. I don't quite know what that means. But if I say, yeah. But what have you actually explained then? It's just so abstract and empty that it doesn't really say much at all, right? So he says, when the laws thus coincide, they lose their specific character, the law becomes more and more superficial, and as a result, what is found is in fact not the unity of these specific laws, but a law which leaves out their specific character. So just as the one law, which combines in itself the laws of falling terrestrial bodies and the motions of heavenly bodies, in fact expresses neither law. The unification of all laws in universal attraction expresses no other content, just the mere notion of law itself, which is posited in that law in the form of being. Yes. Now, this is just the point in section 1.52. He points out the fact that law does not ground its own necessity. So it's true that this property is the essential and sole property of this force, but that it belongs to it necessarily. But necessity here is an empty word. Force must, just because it must, duplicate itself in this way. Of course, given positive electricity, negative 2 is given in principle. For the positive is only as related to a negative, or the positive is in its own self the difference from itself, and similarly with the negative. But that electricity as such should divide itself in this way is not in itself a necessity. Electricity's simple force is indifferent to its law, to be positive and negative. And if we call the former its notion, but the latter its being, then its notion is indifferent to its being. It merely has this property, which just means that this property is not in itself necessary to it. In other words, saying that if you're describing electricity, and you're saying electricity, and I say, why does electricity have this positive and negative, these charges? And I say, oh, just because there's a law that says it does. I haven't really explained why, giving you an explanation as to why that force is the way it is. So yeah, it doesn't, so the law doesn't explain the necessary of the existence. And then the law doesn't explain force, seems to be the point about explanation. So we enunciate a law, and from this its implicitly universal element or ground is distinguished as force. But it is said that this difference is no difference, rather that the ground is constituted exactly the same as the law. So the single occurrence of lightning is apprehended as universal, but this universal is enunciated as the law of electricity. The explanation then condenses the law into force as the essence of law. This force then is so constituted that when it is expressed, opposite electricities appear, which disappear again into one another. That is, force constituted exactly the same as law. There is said to be no difference whatever between them. The differences are the pure universal expression of law and pure force, but both have the same content, the same constitution. Thus, the difference qua difference of content of the thing is again withdrawn. In other words, the law doesn't really do anything than just repeat what the actual force is. This is my very poor attempt at making this make sense. So imagine a child asks, why did the pen fall? The adult says, oh, because the force of gravity pulls it down. But what grounds the force of gravity? Oh, well, it's a natural law. It's a natural law of the force of gravity that makes gravity behave that way. But why is this force of gravity a natural law? What makes that law the law? No reason. There's nothing there. That's just the way it is. The law of gravity just is. So the pen falls because of the force of gravity that is grounded in the law of gravity, but this law exists just because it does. Exactly. So your explanation of the pen falling is that it falls just because it does. That would be the idea of why there's not really an explanation being offered here.
Is the child Hegel as a child?
I don't know. I had the child just as a, I don't know why as a child. It could have been anyone, really. Yes. So the law can help us identify patterns in the world and join together diverse appearances. Yes. But that doesn't explain to us the way, in what way that law exists, why it exists, or if there's another law behind the law. So then to what extent does that supersensible law explain reality? Then we get to the inverted world. Okay, so the inverted world is just really crazy. He now comes to this point where he says, okay, so you see these problems with the idea of the law of nature. The laws don't really help explain the world. So for this supersensible world to actually give you a true explanation of the world, it wouldn't just be repeating what's in the world. It would actually be something radically different. It would actually be, so for this other world to have real revelatory explanatory power, it would have to be something where this world, this supersensible world, is now the exact opposite of the world of sense. So this section of the phenomenology, it's just so notoriously difficult to interpret that I'm just going to give you an interpretation, and then you can have fun pulling it apart and pointing out why it's wrong, as I'm most certain that it is. But it is a really strange thought. But he basically says, so you have this inverted world, and in this inverted world, everything is actually the opposite of what it is in the world of appearance. So what looks like, what tastes sweet, is really actually sour. The North Pole is actually South Pole. What he presents itself as oxygen would be the hydrogen pole. I don't even know how they're opposites, but that's basically the idea. It's this inverted world. So what is Hegel talking about? Here is my interpretation. What does he go to the inverted world? So if this supersensible world is going to have explanatory force, so if it's not just going to be repeating what's in appearance, but actually give us insight into the real behind reality, then it must be really different from what appears. But if we arrive at this idea of the supersensible world, what you've arrived at is this world where everything in appearance is actually its opposite. And what's causing this inverted world, this world where everything is actually the opposite of what it appears, is actually, now we know, is this activity of the subject. So what the inverted world shows is that the understanding in trying to grasp the world is always going to turn the world into something other than what it is. And this activity of trying to turn the world into something other than what it is just a necessary part of what understanding does. And it involves, so that whenever we're talking about what is there, what we're involving is this, it's always going to be working then in these contradictions. And what you're basically moving towards here then is what the inverted world shows you is almost like what understanding is always doing when it's trying to grasp the world. It's if you're trying to push beyond appearance into something other than appearance, then what knowledge is always doing is creating something other than appearance and trying to get beyond it. And that pushing beyond appearance to get beyond appearance is just the way in which the understanding functions, and which means that any concept or any attempt of appearing, this relationship of understanding is always going to involve these relationships of contradiction. So rather than seeing the supersensible realm as some other, rather we need to see the supersensible realm as actually, no, it's just this activity of understanding. It's that what is there is constantly going to be undermined by what knowledge is attempting to do. So I'll try to unpack this. It's like, so rather than seeing gravity as something that's out there existing independently of us, rather you need to see human activity trying to make the world no longer alien to itself, brings tools to bear, cognitive tools, tools of understanding to bear to grasp that world. But in doing so, in making that world homely, making it understandable, it turns that world into something other than appearance. But that activity of turning the world into something other than appearance is what the world is. If you want to look at the whole and you want to think subject and substance, then the very activity of Newton drawing on all that other human knowledge to come up with that law of gravity at that point in time is what's happening in reality. And rather than seeing that as human subjects grasping some ungraspable other, the way in which that subject is grasping the other just is what is there. And you have to think subject and substance together rather than thinking the object is something impossible that we never grasp. Now, once you see the law of gravity that way, it's no longer it's like you no longer see the gravity as an independent reality. Rather, what's happened is, because of the way in which a particular human society, a particular point in time was grasping the world, it was able to see and this one aspect of reality in a particular way for a particular purpose. So the law of gravity is useful. It's true. It's part of an ongoing dialectic interaction between knowledge, between the former self and the inner self. It's all those things. But what it isn't is some sort of ultimate explanation for everything, right? It's like it's one way in which human beings are grasping the world in particular ways. Oh my goodness! And this is let's just go back to Hegel. So then, from this inverted world, you get to the idea of infinity, which is what I just tried to describe. And how much longer do we have? Yeah. So, but I might just have to go over this fairly quickly. But this is the idea here. We now have to begin to think of contradiction, this difference between understanding, which is saying that there's an opposite out there, which is the true understanding of something, the supersensible world, versus what's actually there. That's actually just activity of the subject. But what's there is this activity of the subject. So we have to think these constant oppositions, these contradictions, as just being a part. We have to see that as what is actually there. And that leads to the idea of infinity. And the perception of infinity is just where you try to think of these. It's sort of what I just tried to articulate. I think where you still see what's happening in terms of that development of the understanding of the object as something that's always caught up with the activity of the subject, so that those contradictions that are appearing as knowledge is created are actually the reality that is that's occurring. I'm not going to be able to do this justice in the time that we have left. Sorry. So these are the four. So he says that the dualism, though, between appearance and the supersensible is ultimately overcome through this idea of infinity, where you see the way in which understanding is dividing things up as actually a part of what's there and as part of this almost like a force that's driving through what's there to make sense of things. Then he has, at the end of this section is a pretty nice language. So the simple infinity of the absolute notion may be called the simple essence of life, the soul of the world, the universe of life. The omnipresence is neither disturbed nor interrupted by any difference, but rather is every difference, as also their supersession. It pulsates within itself and does not move, inwardly vibrates, yet is at rest. And so you can see he's trying to think almost this absolute totality of, let's look at this dialectic of understanding as being what's there. It's like you begin to see this spirit of reason, mind, operating through the world dialectically and so that these moments that look like this constant sundering, self-sundering, actually come together for this in the totality. Yes. And that's sort of how this section ends with the infinite view of the world. And I like this section 163. The point, just that the understanding is always caught up in its consciousness, which leads on to the idea that in the end, to have any idea of understanding, you actually do need to bring in some idea of the subject. And this is similar to the idea of gravity here. Like, the reason why explaining affords so much self-satisfaction, in other words, why are we doing these things like explaining the force of nature when he just pointed out doesn't really explain anything? It's like, well, part of what makes it so satisfying is because consciousness is, so to speak, communing directly with itself when it does these things. It's enjoying itself. Although it seems to be busy with something else, it is in fact only occupied, this whole time what it's occupied with is actually consciousness itself. And then so you have the shift to self-consciousness, realizing that what we really need to do, the subject is actually always caught up with our knowledge of the objective world. So what we need to do now is that all the whole time what we're really talking about is what this thing called self-consciousness is doing. And then we have to explore that in a separate section. And that's where the dialectic goes next. So if our understanding of the objective world is always caught up with the subject in some way, well then self-consciousness must be always involved in knowledge. And now we have to move on. The next stage of the dialectic is then to ask this question, okay, well then what is self-consciousness? And how, and what are the different forms of self-consciousness, which is what the next section is about, to actually understand what this objective reality is. I think I'm going to leave it there. I've explained that, and that's all good. So that leads us to self-consciousness. That is what we'll look at next week. And we have about 8 minutes for questions, but please don't feel like you have to stay behind. And next week we'll aim to, I think, well, self-consciousness, I think, is the funnest section. Master-slave dialectic, skepticism, stoicism. So yeah, once you've got past force and understanding, I think you've probably gone through the hardest part of the book, except for absolute knowing. So well done, everybody. That's it. No, I think Essie's gone, and Josiah just said that the kid would be smart, and I think someone else said that. Sounds like a little Hegel.